Welcome to another Ginger Prince production video. This video is going to look at morality, which is always a good subject, and I want to look at oughts and morality. You often hear you ought to do this, or there are no oughts in secular morality, or other sort of statements thrown around about oughts and moral oughts, what one should do. And I just want to look at the term oughts and see whether it's coherent, whether people really understand how to apply it correctly, and what my take is on a moral ought. So hopefully this will be interesting. Post any comments as ever, or questions, and please like it too if you do. Yeah. The first thing to talk about with regards to oughts is the linguistic, the grammatical usage of the word oughts. Now, I understand it, and many other philosophers understand oughts to only make sense in a conditional statement. That means if I want my car to run well, then I should change the oil. So therefore, I should change the oil, or I ought to change the oil, on its own actually makes no sense. It depends upon what is called the protasis in a sentence. That means the if part of a sentence. So if I want my car to run well, then I ought to change the oil. And the ought part is what's called an apodosis. So you have a protasis at the beginning and an apodosis afterwards. If I want my car to run well, then I ought to change the oil. If I just had I ought to change the oil on its own, just an intrinsic ought that has a value just in and of itself, I ought to change the oil actually makes no sense, because you don't know what the end goal is. It depends, it necessitates a goal. I ought to change the oil makes no sense. It makes sense if I want my car to run well, then I ought to change the oil. But what if I was a scientist that was experimenting on what would happen to a car if I don't change the oil? Therefore, for my experiment to make any sense, I ought not to change the oil. So therefore, I ought to change the oil requires narrowing down why I ought to change the oil. So it needs this protasis. If I was doing the experiment to find out the effects of not changing oil on a car, then I ought not to change the oil. But just on its own, I ought to change the oil, or I ought not to change the oil, is absolutely meaningless. And I would posit it is exactly the same for morality. I ought to be good on its own is meaningless. I ought to be good. Why ought I be good? Now, a lot of theistic, a lot of religious philosophers will try to claim that you ought to be good in order to be good. This is we're getting into the territory of tautology. All bachelors are unmarried. Well, yeah, of course. You know, I ought to be good in order to be good is the same as saying I ought to change the oil in order to change the oil. So it's a logical fallacy. It's a circular argument. Now, in certain situations, it can make sense, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I would say that simply saying you ought to be good doesn't make sense. It's meaningless and requires a protasis. If I want to get into heaven, then I ought to be good. If I want to be happy, then I ought to be good. If I want society to run well, then I ought to be good. If I don't want to go to hell, then I ought to be good. These oughts require a protasis. And in fact, what you see there is the oughts lead to a goal. And in morality, or in moral philosophy, this is called consequentialism. I ought to do something in order to reach a consequence, or to get a consequence. If I want my car to run well, that's a consequence, then I ought to change the oil. So I'm doing this action in order for a consequence to happen. And this is very different to what a lot of religious moralists will claim. They might claim I ought to be good because it's in God's nature, or I ought to be good in order to be good, lots of other things. But I would claim I ought to be good makes no sense on its own and is a goal-oriented statement. It is an apodosis which very often has a missing protasis. So we assume it, like, I ought not to steal from that shop. There's a hidden protasis, which is if I don't want to get into trouble, or if I want to lead a happy life, or so on and so forth, whatever it is, it's hidden there, and you don't say it. You just say, I ought not to steal from that shop. But actually, you are hiding an assumed bunch of protases. So that's my first point on morality and oughts. The fact that an ought makes no sense on its own. So let's return to the notion of being good in order to be good, and whether that's circular and whether it makes no sense. In morality, especially when we talk about consequentialism, doing things for a consequence, we talk about things having non-derivative value. They are axiomatic. You can't reduce them any further. And I would argue that happiness is one of these things. So, for example, it does make sense for me to say, I am going to do something in order to be happy. And if someone says, well, why do you want to be happy? I can answer, in order to make me happy. That's because you can't derive it any further, because it has intrinsic value. I can be happy. Being happy makes me happy. It's literally the emotion of happiness has value in and of itself. You know, it's a positive thing. You can't derive it any further. I don't want to be happy in order to achieve something else. It really is the rock bottom. You cannot reduce it any further. Therefore, it does make sense to say, I want to do something in order to be happy. And if someone say, why do you want to be happy? I can say, so I can be happy. However, having said that, being a moral consequentialist as I am, I would say that good is not non-derivative, which means that you can derive it further. I don't think it makes sense to say, why are you being good in order to be good? I don't think it has what's called intrinsic value in and of itself. I think you see goodness in terms of other values. You value it using something else, such as happiness, whatever it may be. I'm not really interested in this discussion as to what you can value goodness in, but I do think it is derivative, which means you can derive it further. The next substantive thing I wanted to say, I'm not actually going to go in fully into this video because it will take too long, but it's to do with something called reasons internalism and reasons externalism, which in philosophy is to do with motivation for action. It's not to be confused with moral internalism and moral externalism, which is a slightly different thing, although it does affect morality and your motivation to act morally. And basically, reasons internalism states that reasons are only reasons if they're in line with your motivation to do something. So, and this would be internal to the agent, to the person. So, for example, you couldn't have someone dictating to you that you ought to do something unless you yourself internally saw the connection between the reason to do something and actually going and doing it. So the sort of the dictation that you ought to do something doesn't really make sense. It's kind of incoherent with the reasons internalist. And it's something I adhere to. I think. I mean, it's a difficult area of philosophy, and there's lots of ins and outs. But it seems to make more sense to me reasons internalism, and as a result, actually, it means that these kind of oughts that sit out there aren't really kind of objective oughts per se. They're only an ought if the person doing the reasoning reasons that and is motivated to act upon it. So that's a broad overview of reasons internalism, and I won't go into it in massive detail, but basically there are two things I wanted to say about oughts and morality. The first is that grammatically an intrinsic ought doesn't make sense, an ought on its own. You have to have the protasis to make it work, in which case you have consequentialism as a moral ethic, rather than objective morality that has intrinsic moral value. And the second point is that as far as reasons to act morally, they have to be internal rather than external. They have to come from your own internal reasoning rather than someone else or something else reasoning it for you and dictating a moral ought. So those two things are the things I wanted to say. Sorry I took my time in saying them. Any questions or points, post them. And if you're interested in stuff like this, I've written two books, a book on free will called Free Will, an investigation into whether we have free will or whether I was always going to write this book, and my second book, the little book of unholy questions, which is a set of questions to ask God, and some of my videos have been about that, so don't be afraid to go and get them on Amazon. Take it easy, and thanks for watching.